The Civil War is remembered as the war that was responsible for the most losses in American life in history. The war was fought between the Union and the Confederacy, both having different reasoning behind fighting the war. The Union's objectives during the Civil War were to preserve the Union and to abolish slavery.
For the Union, for the North, it was about preserving the country and preserving the Union. Initially, certainly. As the war went on, as the Union started to achieve more successes and they started to, themselves enter the South, it started to shift for Lincoln to encompass the broader idea of slavery, which is really one of the major reasons the war was fought in the first place, was because of the disagreement that the North and the South had over slavery.
At the start of the Civil War, the Union's resources heavily outnumbered that of the Confederates. The Union not only had a much larger army, but also the superior industry, rail line, and the economy to back them up. This surplus allowed for the Union to be much more aggressive in their battle strategy, especially when planning out campaigns. Union generals, especially at the beginning of the war, tended to be a lot more aggressive in battle and lost a lot more troops to the more conservative and well-experienced Confederate generals.
Some of the Union generals were known as being kind of careless with their men's lives. They would send them into attacks that had very little reward versus the number of men that they were going to lose. Whereas in the South, Southern generals tended to be a little bit more conscious of their soldiers and the value of those soldiers, and so they wouldn't put them in a situation necessarily where they were going to go into a slaughter. And again, that's a reflection of the fact that the North had more soldiers and the South didn't.
The Union often ran several campaigns at once as to spread the Confederate army, which was already small as it is. The Union often targeted cities of industry, trade, and transport.
The North had thousands of miles more tracks and trains, for that matter, than the South did. And so the ability to be able to quickly move soldiers from one place to another to reinforce an area or to defend an area for the North is going to be essential. It's going to make it a lot harder for the South to effectively attack the North and maintain that attack, because the North can continue to bring soldiers in from other states using the rail lines. And of course, that goes the same for supplies. It's going to be a lot easier for the North to bring food and supplies to their soldiers.
The Union's objective at the start of the war was to maintain Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri as best as they could. In doing so, they would produce a buffer between the Confederacy and Washington, D.C., and also further weaken the Confederacy by limiting the amount of states that would join them. The only way for the Union to overcome the South's war of attrition was to destroy their morale and resources through total war. The Union used parts of the Anaconda Plan to surrender, choke, and block the South from the rest of the world.
They were able to more effectively blockade and keep supplies from getting in there. And we're talking like basic supplies. Sugar, became non-existent, for example, in the South. Salt was very difficult to come by, things that an average soldier would need on the march. So forget about major materials that you need to fight a war, like gunpowder, cotton for uniforms, and things like that. The South was pretty effectively blockaded.
The Anaconda Plan was created by General Winfield Scott and was supposed to be a way for the Union to win the war with the least amount of losses. The Anaconda Plan was a naval strategy in which the Union Navy would blockade southern ports, capture New Orleans, and control the Mississippi. In doing so, the Union would fully surround the South. By doing so, the South would have been surrounded and would have been choked slowly into submission. Not only did this strategy further hinder the South's already limited resources, but it also destroyed the South's economy and morale. As anti-war sentiment grew in the North, and with the upcoming election of 1864, Lincoln needed progress from his military. In reaction to this, the Union brought the war to the Confederate citizens as to speed up the rate of war. After capturing Atlanta, a major railroad hub and industry center, on September 2, 1864, Sherman began his march 1 month later, crossing Atlanta all the way to Savannah with his army of 60,000 in an attempt to destroy Georgia and other southern states' support of the Confederacy.
Well, we certainly know that Sherman, in his march to the sea, that was, one of his primary functions, one of his primary objectives was to wage total war. He wanted to make it uncomfortable for the citizens who were supporting the Confederacy by destroying everything in his path. So they destroyed morale by destroying cities, by burning homes, by confiscating property, confiscating livestock and using it for their own need.
As Sherman marched, his armies destroyed anyone's belongings for whom opposed him. Sherman and his army also killed horses, destroyed rail lines, and burned farms. Actions like these caused anti-war sentiment throughout the South, especially in the key areas that were affected by it.
As the war went on, the Union got stronger and the South got weaker.
The Confederates' overall objectives in the Civil War were to secure their independence from the Union and to establish their own nation where they had political freedom and they could maintain slavery.
Ultimately, the right that they were arguing about was slavery more than anything else, that they wanted to maintain slavery. They felt that it was essential for their economy, and they wanted to make sure that they had the right to preserve that institution.
The Confederates' plan throughout the war was to defend their land, prevent the North from seizing their army, to break the Union's will to fight, and most importantly, keep slavery. The South stayed mainly on the defensive. The South had fewer troops in comparison to that of the North, and they had to take a more defensive and conservative approach to warfare.
The South had an abundance of the better trained leaders in generals, but they had a limited amount of supplies. All the factories were in the North, So for the North, it was a matter of attrition. It was a matter of time. They could afford, they had a larger population, they had more weapons, they had more ammunition, they had more cannons, they had more railways and more trains to transport. And so they could afford to take losses that the Confederacy could not afford to take. The Union was able to replace the men and the materials that it lost for the Confederacy. That really wasn't possible.
The Confederates did not need to completely defeat the Union, but they needed to outlast the Union's will to fight. The South used their knowledge of their land to their advantage. The Confederates often chose the best times and places to retreat to and to build their defensives and plan out battles accordingly.
They start building trenches, so it becomes more World War I style tactics where they're digging these trenches and they're sniping back and forth at each other.
A key tactic for the Confederacy during the Civil War was to keep morale high. The Confederate government worked hard to legitimize itself in the eyes of their citizens, and tried to bond the states together through a strong sense of nationalism. By maintaining a strong sense of nationalism and a high morale, the Confederacy could keep support for the war effort.
You need the support of the people to keep the army going. You need the support of the people who are growing the food to feed the army, the people who are manufacturing the weapons. And when you lose the support of the people, then the army is going to fall apart.
Although Confederate morale was high at the beginning of the war, events occurred which brought it down. One example of this is that the government began to seize public supplies to support the war effort. Citizens felt that their personal property was being invaded and that the compensation they received was inadequate. Multiple losses, especially towards the end of the war, and the destruction caused by the Union also heavily hindered the Confederate morale. The
average Southern soldier wasn't necessarily a slaveholder. Most of the slaveholders were plantation owners. The guy who's got the farm and he's working with his family, at some point they have to start to question, why am I fighting to preserve their right to own slaves? Although, the South had intense pride, but certainly it's going to affect morale. Any soldier who's in a dangerous situation, these guys were out there year round. They didn't call it quits when winter set in. So if you're in uncomfortable quarters and your life is in danger on a fairly regular basis, and you don't have even the little comforts that would make the situation like coffee. So when you don't have those little luxuries, and you're out on a battlefield, or you're in camp for the winter, it's going to make morale very low. And of course, that's then going to lead to desertions, which the South couldn't afford.
As the war raged on, the South's supplies and morale continued to dwindle until April 9, 1865, when the last major Confederate army under the guidance of Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union forces at the Appomattox Courthouse, marking the end of the conflict. Today, the tactics used in the Civil War continue to be a major area of interest for both historians and war enthusiasts alike.